The neurologist did not look at Victor when he said it. That was what Victor remembered, weeks later, when everything had changed. Not the words themselves, but the way Dr. Brennan kept his eyes fixed on the scan pinned to the light board, as though meeting the father's gaze might make the sentence harder to deliver. There are no further options we can offer Caitlin at this time. We've done everything within our power. The fluorescent light hummed. Outside, Toronto kept moving. Taxis, streetcars, February sleet against glass, and Victor Ashmore stood very still in the middle of it all, a man who had built a mining company worth $3 billion from the ground up and could not think of a single thing to do. Caitlin was 15. She had her mother's laugh and his stubbornness, and 8 months ago she had been accepted to the national youth swim team. Now she lay in a room at Toronto General with monitors tracing the slow, irregular rhythm of a nervous system that had decided, without permission, to stop working. The condition was called Progressive Cortical Atrophy Syndrome, PCAS. There were fewer than 40 documented cases in the world. The brain, for reasons no researcher had fully mapped, began to withdraw, quietly, methodically, from the body it was supposed to govern, motor function first, then sensation, then, eventually, everything else. The specialists at the Cleveland Clinic had called it a tragedy without a playbook. The team in Zurich had been kinder in tone, and no different in conclusion. Victor had spent 4 months and more money than he cared to count, and the answer was always the same answer. His ex-wife, Lorraine, had begun to speak in the careful language of acceptance. She left pamphlets on the side table of the family waiting room. She cried quietly in the parking garage, where she thought no one could hear her. She was trying to love Caitlin well through what was coming, and Victor understood that. He understood it, and could not do it, could not make his hands release. He left the hospital on a Thursday in late February, without a destination. His driver offered. Victor shook his head and walked. The wind off the lake was something physical, a presence, rather than a sensation, and he let it push him east through the distillery district, past the antique brick and the coffee shop windows fogged with warmth inside. He didn't know how long he walked. He found himself eventually at the edge of a small weekend market set up in a community hall near Riverdale. Vendors in folding booths, the smell of cedar and dried herbs, hand-stitched goods spread over wool blankets. He went in because he was cold, that was all. She was sitting cross-legged on a low stool, behind a display of beaded work, a girl of perhaps 11, doing homework in a yellow notebook. She had dark braids and a too large gray sweater, and the particular focused quiet of a child who is accustomed to waiting for adults to finish things. She looked up when Victor stopped at the booth, and then she looked at him for a moment longer than was ordinary. "You're really sad," she said, not unkindly, matter of fact, the way children sometimes are when they haven't yet learned to look away from something true. Victor almost walked on. He didn't know why he stopped. "I'm all right," he said. "You're not," she said, and closed the notebook. "Is it someone you love?" He didn't answer. He picked up a small beaded medallion from the display, blue and white, a pattern he didn't recognize, and turned it over in his hands. "Who made these?" "My kokum, my grandmother." The girl tilted her head. "She's Anishinaabe. The patterns are medicines, kind of. Different ones mean different things." A pause. "She uses them when she's healing people." Victor set the medallion down. "Your grandmother is a healer. People come to her." She said it simply, without performance. "She knows things about the nervous system that the doctors at Sick Kids didn't believe, but she was right anyway." She looked at Victor steadily. "I had a disease 3 years ago. They said I would stop breathing on my own by Christmas. I didn't." The market noise continued around them, a vendor calling out, a child laughing somewhere near the far doors, and Victor felt the floor shift slightly, or perhaps it was only him. "What disease?" he said carefully. "PCAS," she said, Progressive Cortical Atrophy Syndrome. He bought the medallion. Her name was Penny. Her grandmother's name was Rose. Before he left that night, Penny wrote a phone number on the corner of a paper bag and tore it off and handed it to him with a seriousness that belonged on someone 3 times her age. "She won't ask for anything," Penny said. "She just wants to help if you have someone who needs it." Victor drove home with the paper in his jacket pocket and told himself it was a coincidence, a sad child misremembering a misdiagnosis, the kind of story desperate parents spin into gold because they need something to hold. He told himself this for 4 days. On the 5th day, he called the number. Rose Makwa lived in a small house in Oshawa, 40 minutes east of the city, with a wood stove and a garden put to sleep under snow and shelves that held more jars of dried things than Victor had ever seen outside an apothecary. She was 71 years old and moved without hurry and made tea before she said anything else. She did not seem surprised to see him. She brought out a folder without being asked. Penny's original hospital records, the diagnosis confirmed by 3 separate pediatric neurologists at SickKids, the brain imaging, the prognosis. Then she brought out the follow-up, a re-evaluation conducted 18 months later by the same lead physician, Dr. Alan Kerrigan, in which the original diagnosis of PAS was quietly reclassified as a probable misidentification and Penny's recovery attributed to an unrelated spontaneous stabilization. Victor read it twice, then he looked up. He changed the diagnosis. He changed it, Rose said. After I told him I wouldn't let him publish Penny's case under his name, using his methods, pretending his experimental protocols were what helped her. They weren't. He hadn't touched her in 4 months. I'd brought her home. I did what I know how to do. She folded her hands around her mug. He had a research contract with a pharmaceutical company. They were developing a maintenance medication for PKAS. A real recovery, using traditional methods, costing almost nothing. That is very bad for a maintenance drug. So the diagnosis became an error. Victor's legal mind turned over the shape of it quietly. His security team had already done preliminary background on Kerrigan. The physician's research division had received $23 million in funding from Harfield Pharmaceuticals over 5 years. He had not connected those dots fully until this moment. What did you do for Penny, he asked, specifically. Rose talked for a long time. Specific pressure points along the cervical spine and the base of the skull, points mapped by Anishinaabe healers over generations and now partially corroborated by osteopathic literature that mainstream neurology hadn't caught up to yet. Particular rhythms of hand drum played beside Penny for 2 hours each day, calibrated to the body's own neural pulse. Herbal preparations, Labrador tea, sweetgrass infusion, a combination of roots dried and measured with precision, administered in small, consistent amounts through every waking hour. Movement work. Rose would move Penny's arms and legs through deliberate patterns for an hour each morning and each evening, narrating each movement, speaking to Penny as though full comprehension was never in question. Because, Rose said, looking at Victor directly, it wasn't. She heard everything. She just couldn't come back yet. And you talked to her, Victor said. I talked to her all day, every day. I told her what the birds outside were doing. I told her stories about her great-grandmother. I told her about the medicines and what each one was for. Rose paused. I told her I was waiting for her and that I would be waiting no matter how long it took. Victor stared at the table. Outside the window, a crow landed on the snow-covered garden fence and then was gone. He brought Caitlin home 2 weeks later. Lorraine objected, not to the idea of trying, she said, but to the hope of it, to what another failure would do to both of them. She came anyway. She always came anyway, because Caitlin was theirs and that had not changed when the marriage did. The east bedroom of the Ashmore house in Rosedale was converted in 72 hours. The medical equipment Caitlin needed, the nursing staff, the monitors, and alongside all of it, Rose's things, the jars, the handmade tools, the small drum. Photographs of Caitlin at her swim meets were placed where she could see them if she opened her eyes. Her favorite playlist, early Alanis Morissette, which she'd inherited from Lorraine and thought was entirely her own discovery, played softly from a speaker in the corner. Her swim team hoodie was folded on the chair beside her bed. The nursing staff were polite and unconvinced. The lead nurse asked, with careful professionalism, that whatever Rose was doing not interfere with the treatment schedule. Victor said it wouldn't. Rose said nothing and began. For 9 days there was no visible change. Victor sat with Caitlin each evening after Rose's second session, holding her hand, talking about ordinary things, the Leafs, a documentary she'd wanted to watch, whether they should get a dog. He described the dog in detail. A golden retriever, probably a rescue from the shelter on Eastern Avenue, probably too large for the house and entirely untrainable. He gave the dog a name, Bishop, and described Bishop's hypothetical personality and probable bad habits, and Caitlin lay still, and the monitors kept their rhythm. On the 10th night, Victor was in the middle of a story about a canoe trip they had taken on the French River when she was 9. The afternoon they had gotten briefly, embarrassingly lost and had to be redirected by a family of 12-year-olds in a much smaller boat. When he felt it, a pressure against his palm, small, deliberate, there and then gone. He stopped talking. He sat very still for a long moment and then said, "Caitlin, if you can hear me, do that again." 3 seconds, 5. Her hand tightened around his. Victor pressed the call button for the nurse and then bent forward and put his forehead against his daughter's hand, and, for the first time since her diagnosis, he wept. Not quietly, not with composure. The kind of weeping that comes from 8 months of held weight, releasing all at once in the dark, in a room smelling of cedar and antiseptic and dried sweetgrass, with machines and photographs and the faint sound of old music from a corner speaker. Lorraine arrived in 11 minutes. She stood in the doorway, looked at the monitors and at Victor and at Caitlin's face, crossed the room without a word, and took Caitlin's other hand. "We're here, sweetheart," she said. "Both of us. We're right here." The improvement was not linear. There were better days and days that felt like retreat, mornings when the nursing's assessment showed nothing new and Victor had to learn. Consciously, deliberately, like a skill he'd never needed before, to stay in the room with uncertainty rather than fighting it. Rose had told him this would happen. She'd told him healing was not a straight road. He was learning, slowly, what it meant to wait without giving up. 6 weeks after the first hand movement, Caitlin's eyes opened during one of Rose's morning sessions. Not the vacant, involuntary flicker the doctors had documented before. Something else. Her gaze found Rose's face and held. Rose leaned closer. "You don't have to rush, dear one," she said quietly. "We're all still here." Caitlin's lips moved, no sound came. Then on the second attempt, barely breath, tired. Penny, who had been sitting in the window seat throughout the session, looked up from her book and grinned. The uncomplicated grin of a child who already knows how this story ends, because she has already lived it. Victor confronted Dr. Kerrigan the following week. He arrived at the physician's research office at the University of Toronto with his legal counsel and a thick envelope. Penny's original scans, affidavits from 3 independent neurologists who had reviewed the imaging and confirmed the initial PAS diagnosis was clinically correct, and a detailed accounting of Harfield Pharmaceuticals' funding relationship with Kerrigan's department over the past 5 years. Kerrigan had gone pale before Victor finished the first paragraph. He agreed by the end of the hour to formally acknowledge Penny's case in the medical literature and to participate, under significantly circumscribed conditions, on Victor's terms, in a research study examining integrative approaches to PAS treatment. Victor did not believe the conversion was sincere. He believed correctly that it was sufficient. The press conference was held on a Tuesday morning at Ashmore's downtown offices. Victor stood at the podium with Lorraine beside him and Rose on his other side and announced the establishment of the Ashmore Neurological Research Fund. Initial endowment of $40 million, dedicated to the rigorous scientific study of integrative healing approaches for rare neurological conditions. Dr. Kerrigan attended at Victor's specific invitation. He looked uncomfortable throughout and said, when asked to comment, that the evidence warranted further investigation. It was more than he had been willing to say 12 months earlier, and Victor accepted it. At the end of the conference, he showed a short video. Caitlin, sitting up in bed at home, pale but present, her hair loose on her shoulders, looking directly at the camera. "Hi," she said. Her voice was still slow, still finding its shape again. "I know I look like I've had a rough year." A small, crooked smile. Her mother's smile, the one Victor had missed so much he'd stopped being able to recall it clearly. "I have, but I'm still here. And if you have someone you love who's been told there's nothing left to try," she paused, gathered herself, "don't believe it, that's all. Just don't believe it yet." The room was very quiet for a moment. Then someone began to applaud, and the rest followed. 6 months later, on a Saturday morning in August, Victor stood in the doorway of the rehabilitation room and watched his daughter walk, slowly with a 4-point cane, concentrating fiercely on each step, from one end of the room to the other and back again. Penny was there too, counting steps out loud with a cheerful reliability that made Caitlin laugh, which disrupted her balance, which made both of them laugh harder. Rose sat in the corner with her tea and said nothing and looked satisfied. 12, Penny announced. That's a record. I know it's a record, Caitlin said, lowering herself carefully into the chair. I was there. Victor stayed in the doorway. He had learned these past months the particular art of watching his daughter live without needing to fix anything, to simply be a witness to the ordinary, astonishing fact of her presence. He had not mastered it. He was getting better. Later, when Rose was packing up her jars and Penny had fallen asleep over her homework on the couch, Caitlin reached over and touched Victor's arm. Dad. Yeah. I want to learn what Rose knows. She said it the way she said most things now, careful, deliberate, aware of her own breath. When I'm strong enough, I want to help people the way she helped me. Victor looked at his daughter for a long moment. He thought about the man he had been a year ago, the one who believed that enough resources, correctly deployed, could solve any problem. He was not entirely sorry to have been that man, but he was grateful, in a way he had no good language for, that he had walked into a community market on a cold February evening and stopped at a small booth because he was cold, and a girl with a yellow notebook had looked at him and told him the truth without flinching. Then that's what you'll do, he said. Outside, summer was fully itself, green and loud and indifferent to the fear that lived in this house for so long. Caitlin leaned her head against her father's shoulder the way she used to when she was small, and he put his arm around her, and neither of them said anything else for a while. There was nothing that needed saying. She was here. She was tired and getting stronger, and she was here, and the window was open, and somewhere down the hall Penny was sleeping with her cheek on a yellow notebook, and the world outside was going on exactly as it should.